The orphan clung to a Lakota in the storm. By morning, the town had turned on them. The storm came down like punishment on the prairie, flattening grass and turning the sky into a torn black lid, and the orphan ran through it with mud sucking at his boots and rain stinging his eyes, because behind him the town's lanterns were no longer friendly, but hunting lights that bobbed with angry voices calling him thief and curse, words sharp enough to cut a child open, and every crack of thunder made them sound closer, closer, until he could taste their breath. He didn't know where the river ended anymore, only that its roar meant a chance to disappear, and disappearing felt better than being dragged back to the warm kitchens that had slammed their doors on him. Hunger had made him brave and foolish. Brave enough to steal a crust of bread from a window ledge, foolish enough to think no one would care. And now that small sin had turned him into prey, a skinny boy with soaked hair and shaking hands clutching a little sack that held nothing but crumbs in a tin cup. Lightning ripped the dark apart and showed the muddy road, boots splashing, a sheriff's voice barking orders, and the orphan stumbled into tall grass and fell, pressing his face into his sleeve to keep from crying, because crying made you small, and small things got stepped on. The air changed then, cutting through rain with the smell of wet leather and wood smoke, and when he lifted his head, he saw a man standing steady in the storm, wrapped in a dark blanket, hair braided tight, eyes calm in a way that meant he had survived worse than this. The boy's heart kicked hard, because he knew what men said about Lakota after whiskey, but he also knew what men did when they caught him, so he crawled toward the only solid thing in the world and grabbed the man's boots like roots. The Lakota crouched and did not push him away, setting a firm hand on the boy's shoulder and murmuring for him to be quiet as lanterns glimmered through the rain behind them. The orphan shook so hard his teeth clicked, and the man's gaze lifted to the town, to the anger moving through the storm, and something in his face hardened into a decision that already carried a price. He slid an arm under the boy and lifted him against his chest, turning away from the lights toward the darker line of cottonwoods by the riverbank, carrying him through mud and reeds while the town shouted, and a voice cut through the thunder, saying the Indian had him as if the child were a crime. The orphan buried his face in the man's blanket and breathed smoke and rain, feeling a strange, terrifying safety, because safety made you remember what you'd lost. And as the Lakota stepped into the trees and the river's roar swallowed the town, the boy felt a promise in the man's steady stride that by morning someone would answer for this hunt. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a cabin lamp waited, and the Lakota aimed for it with grim purpose, knowing the storm would not hide them forever, and that daylight would bring a reckoning neither of them could escape before the town came to collect. By the time the storm thinned into a gray, dripping dawn, the cottonwoods were steaming like tired horses, and the river slid past in a low brown rush, and the orphan woke on a pallet near a small cabin hearth with his clothes laid out to dry, and a tin cup of warm broth pressed into his hands by the Lakota who had carried him through the night. Yet, whatever fragile safety he felt, cracked when the first bell from town rang across the water, because bells were never for children like him unless something bad was coming. The Lakota stood by the window, eyes narrowed, listening not to the birds but to the sound of boots gathering on wet boards. And when he spoke, it was with a careful steadiness that made the boy's stomach knot, telling him the town had woken hungry for a story, and stories always needed someone small enough to swallow the blame. The orphan tried to explain about the bread, about the hunger that felt like knives, but the Lakota only nodded, already knowing how little mercy lived in a place that called itself lawful. And when a knock came like a fist against the cabin door, the man did not reach for a weapon, only opened it to reveal the sheriff and 3 townsmen, hats dripping, eyes bright with a righteousness that had nothing to do with truth. They did not ask if the child was safe. They did not ask why he ran. They only pointed and said he was wanted for theft and for stirring trouble. And when the Lakota stepped in front of the boy, their voices sharpened, calling him an accomplice, calling him a thief by blood. Because it was easier to turn fear into hate than to admit a hungry child could make a mistake. The sheriff read from a damp paper, a charge written by a shopkeeper who had slept warm while the orphan shivered, and the words sounded heavy and official, even though they carried nothing but resentment. And the townsmen nodded like jurors already convinced, one of them even tying a length of rope loose at his belt as if practice had made him eager. The Lakota refused to move aside, his posture calm but unyielding, and the orphan clutched the edge of his blanket, realizing that the town had not followed the storm to rescue him, but to claim him. And the bell rang again, louder, as if the whole place were calling him back to be judged. When the sheriff threatened to take the boy by force, the Lakota spoke softly, saying there would be no force here, that a child's hunger was not a hanging crime, and that if the town wanted justice, it could start by feeding its lost ones. But those words only fed the men's anger, because shame is loud when it's cornered. They accused the Lakota of hiding criminals, of stirring Indians against good folk, of bringing disorder, and the orphan felt the old ache of being unwanted press against his ribs, wondering if this man would finally decide he was too much trouble to keep. Instead, the Lakota placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and told the sheriff that if they wished to take him, they would have to do it in daylight and with witnesses, because secrets loved darkness and truth preferred to be seen. The men muttered, glancing toward the town where more figures were gathering by the muddy street, and for a moment it seemed they might leave, but a woman's voice cut through the air, crying out that her bread was gone and her shop was empty. And suddenly the lie grew legs, running faster than sense, until the sheriff straightened and declared the boy under arrest. The Lakota did not strike or shout. He simply said no, and in that single word the orphan felt a wall rise, fragile yet stubborn, between him and the rope that waited in the town square. And as the men backed away to gather more bodies, the boy realized that by morning the storm had not washed away danger at all. It had only made the town's cruelty easier to see. The crowd reached the cabin before the sun cleared the river mist, boots and wet skirts filling the clearing with a restless scrape that made the orphan's stomach knot. And from the doorway he saw faces he recognized from warm shops and quiet church pews, now twisted into something colder, something that wanted to see a small body dragged back into order, because order felt safer than admitting they had failed him. And when the sheriff pushed forward with his badge, catching light, he carried not a warrant, but a certainty that law was whatever he said it was. The Lakota stood in front of the boy, shoulders squared, calm like a cliff against a rising tide, and the sheriff announced that the child was to be taken for theft and vagrancy, words heavy enough to sound righteous even when they were empty, and the orphan tried to speak, to explain the bread and the hunger, but his voice was swallowed by the murmur of the crowd, which preferred a story that made them clean. A shopkeeper pointed, a farmer nodded, and a woman clutched her shawl as if the child were a plague, and in their fear, the sheriff found permission, stepping closer and telling the Lakota to move aside or be charged as well, because defying law was worse than starving a boy. The Lakota asked a simple question, where the proof was, and that question struck like a stone, because proof required looking, and no one wanted to look at the way the orphan's ribs showed through his shirt, at the way his eyes tracked every movement like a trapped animal, so the sheriff answered with anger, instead declaring that witnesses were enough and that witnesses had seen the child run from the baker's window. The Lakota replied that witnesses also saw men beat Indians for less, and that did not make it justice, and a ripple of unease moved through the crowd, quickly smothered by the sheriff's raised hand as he ordered 2 deputies forward with rope. The orphan felt his breath shorten, felt the old panic rising, and he grabbed the Lakota's blanket, whispering that he would go if it meant the man would not be hurt, because being a burden was worse than being punished. But the Lakota shook his head once, eyes steady, and told him quietly that no one should ever trade their safety for another's cruelty. The deputies hesitated, not because they doubted the sheriff, but because something in the Lakota's stillness made them uneasy, as if they were about to cross a line that could not be erased. And that pause was enough for the sheriff to bark orders, shaming them into action with talk of law and order. When one of them reached for the boy, the Lakota caught his wrist, not violently but firmly, and the gasp that rose from the crowd was sharp, because they wanted a reason to be afraid, and fear made punishment feel holy. The sheriff seized on it, shouting that the Lakota was resisting arrest, and just like that the story changed, no longer about a hungry child, but about a dangerous Indian, and the orphan watched helplessly as the men he had fled now found a bigger target. A rock flew from somewhere in the crowd, thudding into the dirt near the Lakota's feet, and then another, and the sheriff did not stop them, because chaos made his power easier to use. And in that moment the orphan understood that the town had already chosen its truth, and it was not the one that would save him. They retreated into the cabin as the first stones struck the walls, dull thuds echoing like a warning, and the Lakota shut the door with his shoulder, while the orphan pressed back against the hearth, heart pounding so hard he thought the men outside might hear it. And in the narrow space filled with smoke and fear, the boy felt smaller than ever, wondering if this place he had woken in was about to become a trap. The Lakota slid a wooden bar across the door, not in panic, but with the careful movements of someone who knew how fast a crowd could turn from shouting to killing. And when he turned back, his face held no anger, only a hard resolve that steadied the air around him. He knelt in front of the orphan and told him to look up, not at the window where shadows of boots and hats moved, but at him. And when their eyes met, the boy saw something he had not seen in any grown man before, not pity or annoyance, but a promise that did not waver. He said his name was Matto, and that in his people's way, a name meant a story you were still writing, and that no child should have their story ended by a lie. And those words settled into the orphan like a warm coal. Outside, voices rose, some calling for the sheriff, some calling for rope, and the cabin walls creaked as if they too were afraid, and the orphan whispered that he had only taken bread, that he would give it back if he could. But Matto shook his head and said hunger was not a crime, it was a wound, and wounds needed care, not chains. A fist slammed against the door, and the sheriff's voice cut through, demanding they open up and submit to law, and Matto replied that law without mercy was just another kind of storm, destroying whatever stood in its way. And for a moment, the only answer was the crackle of the fire and the wind rattling the eaves. The orphan hugged his knees, feeling the old fear of being sent away, and he asked Matto why he was doing this, why he would risk himself for a boy the town did not want. And Matto told him that when he was young, his own people had been hunted, that he had seen children taken for being in the wrong place, and that he had promised the spirits he would never look away again. Another stone shattered a window, glass spraying across the floor, and Matto moved to cover the boy without thinking, his body a shield, and in that moment the orphan understood that this man was not saving him out of kindness alone, but out of something deeper. Something that demanded he stand against wrong even when it cost him. The sheriff shouted that they would be back with more men, and that next time there would be no talking, and as the crowd slowly pulled away to gather itself, the cabin fell into a tense quiet, broken only by the rain dripping through the broken pane. Matto knelt again, placing his hand over the orphan's chest where his heart still raced, and told him they would not run like thieves, that they would leave when it was right and with their heads high, and the orphan nodded, gripping that promise like he had gripped Matto's boots in the storm, knowing that whatever came next, he would not face it alone. When the rain finally slowed to a thin, cold drizzle, Matto stepped outside to see what the storm had left behind, and the orphan followed close, afraid to let more than a breath of distance grow between them, because the quiet after violence was often when the worst things happened. The clearing around the cabin was a mess of churned mud and broken twigs, footprints overlapping in a confusion of anger, and as Matto studied the ground, his eyes sharpened, not with fear, but with the focus of a hunter reading a story written in dirt. He knelt and brushed aside wet leaves, revealing something dark and small, half buried near the steps, and when he picked it up, the orphan recognized it with a start, the baker's brass button torn from her coat the night he had grabbed the bread and run. His stomach dropped, because he had not meant to pull it free, but the truth of it shone brighter than any lie the town had told. Matto held the button up, turning it so the dull morning light caught on its worn edges, and said quietly that this proved the woman had been closer to the boy than she claimed, that her story of a thief slipping away unnoticed did not fit what the ground was saying. The orphan felt a strange mix of shame and relief, because while the button showed he had been there, it also showed that someone had tried to stop him, that the baker's hands had reached for more than bread, and that small difference mattered more than the town would ever admit. As they spoke, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a farmhand named Eli, who had watched the night from his own porch, and his eyes darted nervously as he approached, because he knew the crowd would turn on him too if he spoke wrong. Eli said he had seen the baker grab the boy's sleeve and shout before the storm swallowed them both, and that the boy had pulled free and fled, not with a sack of stolen goods, but with empty hands and terror on his face. Maddo listened without interrupting, and when Eli finished, he nodded once, because truth did not need much decoration. The orphan's chest felt tight as he realized someone had seen him as he was, not as a story, and that knowledge was a fragile kind of hope. Eli warned them that the sheriff was telling people the Lakota had kidnapped the child, that the lie was already spreading like rot, and that more men would come soon, and Maddo thanked him because even a small truth was a weapon against a big lie. As Eli slipped away, the orphan looked at the button in Maddo's hand and knew it was more than a piece of metal now. It was proof that the town's anger was built on something crooked, and for the first time since the storm, he felt that morning might yet bring something other than another hunt. By noon, the lie had outrun the truth, and the town gathered at the riverbank with rifles and ropes as if preparing for a festival of punishment, because fear had been fed a story it liked, one where a Lakota and a nameless orphan were the villains, and everyone else was suddenly brave. The sheriff stood on a crate, declaring that the child had been stolen and that the Indian was leading him away to stir trouble, and the crowd roared approval, not because they knew it was right, but because it felt good to belong to something loud. Maddo watched from the trees with the orphan tucked close, feeling the weight of every step they would have to take to cross the water without being seen. And he knew that once the hunt began, it would not stop until someone was caught or broken. Dogs were brought out, their noses low, and the orphan's breath hitched because he had been chased before, and he knew how relentless a pack could be. But Maddo placed a steady hand on his back and whispered that the river would confuse them, that moving water was a kind of eraser. As the first men waded into the shallows, Maddo led the boy upstream, stepping carefully over slick stones, and when they reached a narrow crossing, he lifted the orphan onto his shoulders, holding him high to keep his clothes dry, and that simple act felt like a promise carried in bone and muscle. Shots cracked in the distance, fired not to hit but to scare, and the orphan flinched, but Maddo did not falter, eyes fixed on the far bank where tall grass could hide them. When they reached it, they disappeared into the reeds, moving low and slow, leaving only broken water behind. And the dogs howled in frustration at the edge, because even a lie has trouble crossing a river. From their hiding place, the orphan could see men spreading out like a net, anger making them clumsy, and he realized that by choosing to protect him, Maddo had turned himself into a target, not for anything he had done, but for who he was. And that knowledge made the boy's throat ache with both gratitude and guilt. Maddo told him that courage was not about being unafraid. It was about standing when the world wanted you to kneel. And as the hunt pressed on through the wet fields, the orphan held onto those words like a lifeline, because the storm might have passed, but the real danger was only beginning. They had not gone far beyond the reeds when a shout cut through the tall grass, sharp and close, and Maddo turned just in time to see one of the deputies break from the line of searchers, his rifle raised not to warn but to claim, and the orphan froze as if the sound itself had rooted him to the ground. Maddo pushed the boy down into a hollow and stepped forward, hands open, calling out that there was no need for more fear, but fear was the only thing the man had brought, and it made his finger twitch on the trigger. The shot cracked and a pain like fire tore across Maddo's shoulder, spinning him halfway around, and the orphan screamed before he could stop himself, because blood made everything suddenly real. Maddo fell to one knee but did not drop, turning back toward the boy to make sure he was still hidden. And that look of concern burned itself into the orphan's heart harder than the sound of the gun. The deputy advanced, shouting for Maddo to surrender, because it was easier to point a weapon at someone bleeding than to face what you had done. And the orphan felt a wild urge to run, to be small and fast and gone. But he stayed, because running now would mean leaving this man to die alone. Maddo rose slowly, blood darkening his blanket, and told the deputy that he would not fight, that he would not give the town the excuse it wanted, and that mercy was not weakness even when it hurt, and those words seemed to confuse the man more than any threat. Another shout came from deeper in the grass, and the deputy hesitated, glancing back. And in that brief opening, Maddo took the orphan's hand and pulled him up, moving despite the pain. Moving, because stopping would mean capture. They stumbled through the wet field, Matto's breath coming in tight gasps, and when they reached a shallow ditch he collapsed, pulling the boy down with him, and for a terrible moment the orphan thought he was dead. Matto's eyes opened, still fierce with purpose, and he whispered that the boy must listen, that if the men came close, he must run, must not look back, must live even if it meant leaving him. And the orphan shook his head, tears mixing with rain, because being told to leave was the one thing he could not bear. Footsteps crunched nearby, and Matto closed his eyes for a second as if gathering strength, then pushed himself up again, standing between the orphan and the danger, with blood on his hands and courage in his spine. And in that moment, the boy understood that mercy was not soft. It was the hardest thing a person could choose, especially when it cost them everything. The deputy's shout drew more men through the grass, and their boots trampled the wet field, as if they meant to crush everything that had tried to hide from them. But before they could reach the ditch, a voice rose from the far side of the river, clear and shaking. And it was Eli, standing on the muddy bank with his hands raised, calling out that the child had not stolen anything, that the baker had grabbed him first, that there was a button to prove it, and the crowd hesitated because truth spoken loud has a way of making lies stumble. The sheriff tried to shout him down, accusing Eli of being fooled by an Indian trick, but Eli held the brass button high, its dull gleam catching eyes, and others in the town murmured as they recognized it, because even anger could not hide what was familiar. Matto stood swaying, blood soaking his blanket, and the orphan pressed close to him, listening as more voices began to question the story they had been fed, because doubt had finally found a crack to slip through. The baker herself was dragged forward, face pale, and when she saw the button her mouth opened and closed like a fish, because the truth had a way of cornering liars, and under the weight of the crowd's stares, she admitted she had tried to grab the boy, that he had not taken more than a crust, and that fear had made her shout thief to save her own pride. A low, ugly sound rolled through the people as they realized what they had almost done, and the sheriff's authority wavered, because law built on lies could not stand when the ground shifted. Matto sank to his knees, finally giving in to the wound that had been burning through him, and the orphan caught him, holding his weight with thin arms that felt suddenly stronger than they ever had before. Some in the crowd looked away, ashamed, while others knelt to help, tearing cloth to bind Matto's shoulder, because seeing blood made it harder to pretend they were righteous. The sheriff tried to slip back, but voices called out, demanding he answer for firing on an unarmed man, and for the first time the orphan saw fear in the man's eyes, not the clean fear of a storm, but the dirty fear of being found out. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist, the truth stood exposed in the open, and the town had to face the debt it owed not just to a Lakota it had wounded, but to a child it had nearly destroyed. The crowd gathered again by the river, but this time the mood had changed. The angry heat cooled into something brittle and uncertain, and the orphan watched from beside Matto, who lay propped against a tree with his shoulder bound in torn shirts and careful hands steadying him as the townspeople argued among themselves about what justice was supposed to look like now that their story had fallen apart. The sheriff stood apart, jaw tight, eyes darting, because power is loud when it is certain and quiet when it is cornered, and when Eli stepped forward and accused him of turning a hungry child into a criminal and a protector into a target, the murmurs grew into a wave that could not be pushed back. The sheriff tried to speak of order and law, but his words rang hollow against the image of Matto bleeding in the mud, and even those who had shouted loudest the day before now found their voices faltering, because it is hard to cheer for cruelty when it has a face. A vote was called, simple and raw, and hands rose not to punish the orphan, but to strip the sheriff of his badge, because sometimes justice comes not from rules, but from a crowd finally seeing itself clearly. When the badge was taken, a strange quiet fell, and the orphan felt something in his chest loosen, as if a knot he had carried since before he could remember had finally been cut. Matto watched with tired eyes, not triumphant, only relieved, and he told the boy that this was what standing meant, that when one person refused to move, others sometimes found the courage to follow. The baker stepped forward, tears streaking her face, and knelt in front of the orphan, offering him a loaf of fresh bread with shaking hands. And he took it, not because it erased what had happened, but because accepting it felt like closing a wound. The river flowed on beside them, indifferent and steady, and the orphan realized that while storms and crowds could rise and fall, some things kept moving, carrying away what no longer belonged. And as the sun warmed his face, he knew that this crossing, this moment, was where his old life had ended and something new had begun. By late afternoon, the riverbank had emptied, leaving only the soft hiss of water and the low murmur of people who had chosen to stay. And the orphan sat beside Maddo beneath the cottonwoods, holding the loaf of bread he had been given like a fragile promise, while the town slowly tried to become something different from what it had been that morning. The men who had shouted loudest now avoided his eyes, and the women who had once pulled their children away now watched him with a careful, quiet guilt, as if they were seeing him for the first time as a boy instead of a problem, and that small shift felt larger than any victory. Maddo's wound had been cleaned and bound again, and though pain still lined his face, his eyes were clear, fixed not on the people who had hurt him, but on the child beside him. Because in the end, that was what had mattered most. The orphan asked in a small voice what would happen now, because not knowing was the one fear that never seemed to leave, and Maddo told him that the town would have to live with what it had done, that some would change, and some would not, but that the boy did not have to wait for them to decide his worth. Eli came over with a cup of water and a shy smile, saying that a room had been prepared for Maddo at the boarding house and that the boy could stay too. And when the orphan hesitated, unsure if he was truly welcome anywhere, Maddo rested a hand on his shoulder and said that sometimes belonging began with someone simply saying yes. The orphan felt something warm spread through him, not the hot rush of danger, but a steadier heat that felt like being seen. And he realized that for the first time, he was not being passed from place to place like an unwanted parcel. The sun dipped lower, turning the river to gold, and Maddo spoke of traveling west once his shoulder healed, of open land where a child could learn to breathe without looking over his back. And the orphan listened, imagining wide skies and nights without shouting. He asked Maddo if he could come too, if that offer was real or just a kindness, and Maddo answered by asking him what his name was, because names were the first step toward choosing a future. The boy had no answer, only a hollow space where one should be, and when Maddo smiled gently and said they could find one together, something inside the orphan finally settled, like a storm passing for good, and as the river carried away the last echoes of anger, a new story quietly began. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was not silence. It was a quiet reckoning that no one in that town could ever undo. A hungry child had been nearly destroyed by fear dressed up as law, and a man who chose mercy over safety had paid for it in blood. Yet somehow the truth still found a way to stand. In places like that, justice does not arrive on time, but it arrives when someone refuses to look away. And sometimes that is enough to change everything. Because redemption does not come from crowds or courts. It comes from one person saying, "No, not this time." And somewhere beyond that river, a boy who had once been nameless was finally beginning to believe he was allowed to exist.